1 terabit per second. That number alone should stop you in your tracks. In trials across Beijing and Shanghai, engineers pushed that through open air, not down a cable, open air. That's 20 full-length movies downloaded, finished, sitting on your screen in under a second. Now blink. That took about a third of a second, and in that flicker, this network moved more data than you'll use on your phone all month. 100 times faster than 5G. The network already in your pocket, the one you think is fast. And here's what should worry every telecom company on Earth. The speed is the least interesting part. Because outside Shenzhen, one gray box on a lamppost is holding 12,000 machines in conversation at once, settling decisions between themselves before a human could register anything happened. That isn't a faster phone. That's a world where machines stop waiting on us. So the question was never how fast this runs. It's who ends up holding it. Hit like and subscribe, then stay with me. Because by the end, you'll understand why one country writing the rulebook first could quietly redraw the map of global technology, the ceiling nobody talks about. The final whistle blows, 60,000 people stand up at once, and every one of them reaches into a pocket. You've been in that crowd. Your screen shows full bars, every bar it has, and the photo you're trying to send just sits there, spinning, going nowhere. Almost everyone blames the phone. You hold it higher, as if a few inches of altitude might help. All around you, thousands of people are performing the same small ritual at the same moment, and none of it makes the slightest difference. It isn't the phone. To understand what's really happening in that stadium, you have to give 5G the credit it genuinely earned, because it was never a con, it was a real leap. Before it arrived, a city was covered by a handful of enormous towers, a stadium lit by 4 giant floodlights, blazing in the middle and full of shadows at the edges. 5G threw that design out and strung thousands of small bulbs along every row instead, weaker one by one, but everywhere, and almost nothing wasted on empty seats. It worked so well that we stopped noticing it. A whole generation of things that only function if the network keeps up. What almost nobody mentioned is that it was designed as a bridge, an excellent one, carrying enormous weight, but a bridge all the same. And every bridge has a limit stamped somewhere on the blueprints. That limit is easier to picture than it sounds. Each of those small cells is a room with a single door. Everyone inside can talk and everyone can be heard, as long as the room holds about 1,000 voices. Now walk 60,000 people up to that one door. Nothing dramatic happens. No crash, no outage, no error message. The signal simply fills, the way a room fills. And everyone ends up in the doorway holding a phone with full bars and nothing moving through it. That's the first ceiling. The second one has nothing to do with crowds. It's about time. A child steps off a curb. A car has to see it, decide, and act. On today's network, the message carrying that child takes about 4 milliseconds to arrive, far quicker than you can blink, and completely invisible to a human being. But a car at speed covers 4 more inches of road in that time. 4 inches means nothing to you or me. To 2 self-driving cars trying to agree. In that same instant, on which one of them breaks 4 inches, is the whole argument. Engineers say it more bluntly than any advertisement ever would. 5G was built for people watching content. It was not built for machines making life and death decisions on our behalf. For most of the last decade, that distinction didn't matter because the machines weren't ready either. Now they are, and they're waiting on a network designed when the only thing anyone needed to move quickly was video. And you can't buy your way out of it. Building more towers only adds more rooms, and every new room arrives with the same door and the same 1,000-voice ceiling. This problem cannot be solved by putting up more 5G. To get past a wall like that, engineers had to walk into a stretch of the airwaves that nearly everyone had already given up on. The frequency everyone gave up on. Radio waves come in a range, the way sound does, from a low rumble up to a high whistle. Climb far enough above everything phones use today and you reach a band called terahertz. There is enormous room up there, room for every voice that couldn't fit downstairs, and then some. It also has one flaw that quietly ended 30 years of careers. The air drinks it. The moisture floating invisibly around you right now, in every breath, on every humid afternoon, swallows these waves almost the instant they leave the antenna. A signal can be gone before it crosses the room it started in. It's shouting into thick fog. No echo, no distance. The sound just disappears a few feet from your mouth. Now consider where people actually live. Coastal cities, rain, summer. The conditions that destroy this band are the conditions most of humanity wakes up in every morning. So one research group after another walked up to that wall, ran the numbers, and quietly walked away. It became the frequency you studied if you wanted to lose a decade. The pattern repeated for a generation. A team would arrive excited, build something clever, watch the signal collapse a few feet from the antenna, and eventually publish a careful paper explaining why the whole idea was impractical. Then they moved on to work that could actually be finished. In 2021, two teams in Beijing decided everyone before them had been asking the wrong question. Engineers at the city's University of Posts and Telecommunications had been circling the problem for years. So had researchers inside China Mobile. That year, working together, they finally met in the middle. Everyone before them had treated a signal like a stone you throw. You wind up, you let go, and you hope it lands. They asked what would happen if you never let go of it at all. It sounds like a small distinction. It is the entire breakthrough. Picture watering a garden on a hot afternoon. Widen the nozzle to get more water out, and the stream immediately sags, breaking apart halfway across the lawn. More water, less reach. Unless something keeps pushing behind it the whole way. That's what they built, not a louder transmitter. An antenna that reads the air in front of it thousands of times a second and keeps pushing the signal the entire way there, correcting as the moisture tries to take it. And it was small. The whole thing sits on a chip about the size of a postage stamp, the difference between something that lives on a laboratory bench forever and something a factory can eventually turn out by the thousand. The wall that had stopped everyone for 3 decades never came down. They simply stopped trying to smash through it and started walking the signal across, step by step. The result rewrote the arithmetic. A signal that used to die within a few feet now holds across roughly 300 feet, about the length of a football field indoors or out. And remember that car covering 4 inches of road while it waited for a message? On this, it moves about the thickness of a coin. 2 cars approaching the same intersection can work out between themselves who goes first and act on it before either driver perceives the other vehicle moving at all. Every other team looked at this frequency, hit the same wall, and walked away. One team looked at that wall and found a door in it. If that earns credit, type 1 word in the comments. Genius. It worked, run after run, in a clean and carefully controlled room. A real city is not a clean and carefully controlled room. 40 blocks in Shenzhen. In late 2024, they carried it outside. China Mobile switched on a live network across part of the Baoan manufacturing district in Shenzhen, roughly 40 city blocks of ordinary working street. Of everywhere on earth they could have chosen, they picked the place most likely to humiliate them. Summer in Shenzhen sits above 80% humidity. The air is thick enough to feel the moment you step outside, heavy on your skin, hanging between the buildings. For a signal that gets swallowed by moisture, that isn't a trial. That's a sentence waiting to be read out. Then, add everything else a working city throws at a radio wave. Steel and glass on every corner, concrete that bounces a beam into nowhere, delivery trucks pulling in and out, rain that arrives without warning and stops just as fast. And the crowds. Every person walking down that street is a body of water on 2 legs, drifting straight through the beam, thousands of them, all day long. This is the exact point where breakthroughs usually die. Something performs beautifully indoors, then meets weather and traffic and human beings, and the numbers quietly fall apart. Nobody ever writes that follow-up story. So they switched it on and they watched. There is no clever way to fake this part. Either the numbers hold through a wet afternoon on a real street, or the last 3 years were an expensive story about a laboratory. Across those 40 blocks, out in the heat and the rain and the crowds, the network held an average of 860 gigabits per second, close enough to what it had produced in a sealed laboratory that the engineers called the difference a rounding error. To put that in something you can hold on to, take every book in the Library of Congress, every volume and every page, and move all of it across those city blocks in under 5 seconds. Then do it again, and keep doing it all day without pausing. And it held across all 40 blocks. Not one lucky corner, one unit handing off to the next as somebody walks or drives straight through. A single good reading proves a device works. 40 continuous blocks proves a network works. A technology that only performs in a climate-controlled room is a curiosity. A technology that holds its numbers through a Shenzhen summer, surrounded by steel and rain and bodies, is infrastructure. And they hadn't raised a single new tower to do it. The units were bolted onto lampposts that were already standing on those streets. But the test that may matter most wasn't on a street at all. At a robotics plant outside the city, one unit carried 12,000 sensors along a single assembly line, running for 3 months without one of them falling out of step. Stand on a floor like that and the number starts to make sense. Every arm, Every belt, every joint reporting on itself, heat, position, vibration, where all of it talking at once, all day, with no gaps and no cue. The supervisors on that line noticed something nobody had promised them. They were catching tiny defects in milliseconds instead of minutes for a reason that has nothing to do with raw speed and everything to do with room. The sensor reporting a flaw no longer had to wait its turn to be heard. Which is what all of this actually looks like on the ground. Not a faster download, a crack found in a part before the next piece gets welded on top of it. A defect caught in minutes means a supervisor walking the line and pulling a batch. Caught in milliseconds, it means the line never built the bad batch at all. Same factory, same people, completely different day. At that point, the question stopped being whether the technology worked. It became who was going to own it. The world starts moving. For 30 years, this corner of the airwaves was where ambitious research went to be forgotten. Then, the money moved. In early 2025, Huawei committed $2.3 billion over 5 years to build the technology into the next generation of its equipment. Not a research grant, not a pilot, but a bet placed on hardware that takes years to reach a customer. Phone makers moved in behind it. Xiaomi confirmed its flagship devices would carry compatible chips from 2027, and you do not design a phone around a network that doesn't exist yet unless you are confident it will be switched on and waiting by the time that phone reaches a shelf. The second signal was quieter, and in some ways, more telling. In Finland, Nokia reopened research it had effectively shelved years earlier, and said plainly that the results out of Shenzhen were the reason. Nobody restarts a program they already abandoned unless somebody has just proved they were wrong to quit. And consider what that meant for the people in those rooms, researchers who had spent a career being told this band was a waste of a good mind, watching their old work land back in the middle of the conversation. The third signal never made a headline, because it wasn't a product or a payment, it was a document. China's technology ministry published a draft rulebook for 6G, which frequencies do what, and what all of it gets called years ahead of the international schedule everyone else was working toward. That sounds like paperwork. It is closer to a land grab. Standards meetings are famously dull, windowless rooms, engineers from a dozen countries arguing for years over definitions almost nobody will ever read, and every one of those definitions eventually becomes a factory, a license, or a border a product cannot cross. When a new generation of wireless is born, committees spend years arguing over definitions before a single tower goes up. The country that walks in with the first serious draft doesn't automatically win that argument, but everyone else now has to make their case on that country's page, in that country's words, against a proposal that already exists. We know how far that advantage travels, because it has happened before. The standards written for 4G in one place ended up governing hardware built on 3 continents, and the people who wrote them collected on that decision for a decade afterward. That wasn't settled by whoever had the best engineers. It was settled by whoever reached the table first, holding a finished draft, while everyone else was still deciding whether the meeting mattered. It reaches into your life more quietly than any of the billions do. Rules like these decide whether your phone works when you land in another country, and which nations spend the next 10 years paying somebody else for permission to use a design. Be honest. Does it unsettle you a little that the rulebook is already being written while everyone else is still reading? Drop one word below. Scary. Momentum is not the same as inevitability, though. And the obstacles still standing have almost nothing to do with physics. What could still break? 3 things stand between one test district and the rest of the world. The first is the one no amount of cleverness has erased. This signal crosses a football field beautifully, and it still cannot get through a wall. Concrete stops it. Heavy rain scatters it. The beam sailing down your street may not reliably reach your kitchen from your own front porch. So, a city can't build this once and be finished. It needs one layer outside and another inside, quietly handing your connection back and forth every time you walk through a door, twice the equipment for the same coverage. Which means the version that eventually reaches you is deeply unglamorous. Something small and gray in the ceiling of every building you spend time in, fitted by somebody on a ladder, on a schedule nobody will ever report on. The second problem lives at the end of a production line, in a bin. Those postage stamp chips are punishing to manufacture. Early runs came out with fewer than 7 in 10 usable, when selling at scale generally demands better than 9 in 10. Everything else is scrap. You cannot wire a country on a factory that throws away a third of what it makes. Closing that gap is slow, unglamorous work, and it is the entire distance between one impressive district and a network anybody can buy. The third problem isn't in a lab or a factory at all. It's in conference rooms, and it may be the worst of the three. The world has not agreed on who gets which slice of this frequency. Until it does, different regions will build to different rules, and the same technology fractures into incompatible dialects, equipment that works perfectly in one country and is dead weight the moment it crosses a border. That isn't hypothetical. The same disagreement slowed the early rollout of 4G by nearly 2 years, and 4G had far less riding on it than this does. The science has already proven what's possible. The distance from one humid test district to the rest of the world is no longer a technical problem, and technical problems were the only kind these engineers could solve on their own. It was never about your phone. Go back to that room with a single door. The old one held about 1,000 voices. This one holds 12,000. Nobody builds a room like that so 12,000 people can watch video on one street corner. This is not a human number. It is a machine number. Picture an intersection with nobody driving. On the networks we have now, each car reacts. It receives information, then responds always half a step behind the world, which is why every self-driving system built so far has been designed around the assumption that it will be slightly late. Take the delay down far enough, and the whole thing changes shape. The cars stop reacting and start negotiating. Two of them arriving at the same corner settle who goes first between themselves, resolve it, and move, and the passenger looking out the window never knows a decision was made. Every near miss you have ever had on a road came down to two people guessing about each other inside the same half second. Take the guessing out, and an intersection stops being a place where two machines hope they have read each other correctly. Now, put it in an operating room. A surgeon's hands move in one city, an instrument answers in another. Today, that lag is something you train around, compensate for, respect. Close it far enough, and it becomes something you forget is there, which is a very different kind of medicine. Or a building that has come down in an earthquake. Instead of a swarm of drones queuing for instructions from one operator on the ground, they divide the rubble between themselves, agree on who searches where, and cover in minutes what would have taken hours. In that situation, hours are the entire story. Everything that matters after a collapse is measured against how long a person can stay alive underneath it, or a port at 3 in the morning. Cranes, trucks, and ships handing cargo between them with nobody standing in the middle translating one machine's intentions to another. None of those are faster downloads, not one of them. The real product is not speed, it is coordination. And because the hardware hangs on poles that are already standing, it spreads fastest exactly where those poles are thickest dense city blocks, busy factories, crowded ports, which is also the problem. Every leap in wireless has followed the same route. It arrives first where things are already crowded and already wired, and only much later, if ever, where they aren't. A rural clinic with no dependable line at all, a school still waiting on its first. A disaster response team working somewhere the towers were the very first thing to fall, which is precisely the situation where machines coordinating instantly would save the most lives. Those places are consistently the last to receive it. So the question underneath all of this was never really about speed, or even about who wins. It's whether a network built so machines can act instantly ever reaches the people who need it most, or whether it simply lets the cities that were already ahead pull further away from everyone else. The hard part is finished. A dead frequency was brought back. The machine was shrunk to the size of a stamp, and it survived a wet summer on a working street. Everything difficult about it, in the sense engineers use that word, has been solved. What is left is difficult in an entirely different way, the kind that gets argued over rather than calculated. The researchers gave the world a tool. Who picks it up, how quickly, and on whose behalf that belongs to people in meeting rooms now, not to anyone in a laboratory. So here is what this was actually about. Not a phone that downloads faster. A layer of infrastructure that lets thousands of machines coordinate almost instantly and hands a long, quiet advantage to whoever builds it first and writes the rules everyone else has to follow. That's the part that outlasts the headline. Speed can be matched. A rulebook, once everybody is arguing inside it, is far harder to take back. Every real leap in how things talk to each other has rearranged ordinary life afterward. Never with an announcement. Just a slow shift in what suddenly became possible, until nobody could quite remember doing it the old way. And the strangest part is how little there is to see. No towers on the horizon, no cables being laid down the street, just a small gray box bolted to a lamppost, moving more information in a second than most of us will use in a year. The infrastructure that changes the most is almost always the kind nobody notices. So tell me what you think in the comments, and I mean it. I read everyone. Do you believe this actually reaches rural and developing regions within a decade? Or does it stay locked inside the wealthy cities, the way every generation before it has? And if this changed how you think about what a wireless network really is, hit like and subscribe. That's the whole reason I get to keep making these. Somewhere tonight, a lamppost is humming quietly in the dark, and the world walks past it without ever looking up.